you know, knowing, you know, kind of the, you know, where we are with regard to not just COVID, but of course the Black Lives Matter movement. I will say that, you know, for years prior to the, I guess the kind of the most recent resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, New Hampshire's colleges and universities have really been at the forefront of the state's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, DEI for short, as they seek to make not just their student populations, but their workforces more just places for everybody. And today we're going to be hearing from several of the state's collegiate DEI offices to learn more about how these institutions make their campuses more welcoming to people of color and how in the process they make them more attractive places to study and to work. The panelists will also share lessons learned and advice on actionable steps that all of you can take to perhaps make your own organizations more diverse, equitable, and inclusive as well. Before we jump in, I'll also note back to the comments section, if anyone has any questions for our panelists, feel free to just throw them down there in the comments section. We'll try to get to as many as we can in our time today. So with that, I will introduce our panelists and we can jump right in. So let me scroll back up. Maria Aguirre is the Diversity and Inclusion Project Coordinator at Southern New Hampshire University. Maria was born in Ecuador and moved to Nashua at a young age. She's always been an advocate for underrepresented populations and has a passion for fostering inclusive environments. Her cultural and life experiences have provided her an appreciation and understanding of cultural norms and differences and the importance these hold for individuals. Maria helped to establish the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention chapter here in New Hampshire and enjoys being involved in the community in her free time. She uses her professional background along with her passion for education, diversity, equity, and inclusion to help others navigate difficult situations and facilitate constructive dialogues. So welcome, Maria.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Next up, we have Sofia Brelvi, who is the Director of Programming for the Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity and the Deputy Title IX Coordinator at Dartmouth College. Sofia has an extensive background in law and a passion for social justice. Graduating with honors in international business, political science, and Middle East and North African diasporic studies, Sofia matriculated through law school focusing on international affairs and regulatory law. Shortly after graduating, she joined the Office of the General Counsel at Morehouse College before coming to Dartmouth. Welcome, Sofia.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
Yes. And finally, we have Allison Ryder, who is the Program Manager for the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity at the University of New Hampshire, a position she has held since 2019. Allison is responsible for conducting trainings, programming, and outreach across campus in an effort to ensure that the UNH community is a just and equitable one where all feel safe, welcome, and inspired to learn. In addition to her work at UNH, Allison serves the state in numerous ways around DEI issues as members of boards, commissions, and as a regular contributor to the Hippo Press. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you all. Happy to be here.
Great. I would ask, before we jump into the conversation, that maybe if everyone can turn off their cameras, their videos, so that we can focus on our speakers here today and give them our full attention. So with that, again, remember, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we can start off. We can jump right in right now. So, I think it's fair to say, and guys, ladies, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we, more than the public, private, or nonprofit sectors, that academia has, on the whole, has had a DEI and focus for some years now, more than perhaps other sectors. I'm curious to know, when and why did each of your institutions create your respective DEI offices? And again, no order, feel free to jump in.
I can go first. So Southern New Hampshire University had a third-party audit, as you were mentioning, Will, data. So it's not just because it's the right thing, but what is needed. So after a third-party audit, it was identified that we needed an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we established one in 2016.
So similar to, I guess, SNHE's experience, Dartmouth, we started our office about over a decade ago, just because we were sort of tracking the metrics of recruitment and retention, and just seeing exit interviews and the data from that. There's a high need for it. And so they introduced the concept and opened the office about 10 years ago.
So UNH actually has had a variety of efforts dating back all the way to the 1970s, specifically around gender and probably focused more on cis women issues. So that was started in the President's Commission on Status of Women, which again started in the early 70s. And then in the 90s is when we started to really pick up some of our additional efforts. So we started adding a coordinator for minority student recruitment, and that person's still in the role today. And so that helped us try to get more student outreach. And then because we're getting more students of color onto campus, there was another commission added on people of color in the late 90s. And then early 2000s is when the kind of the full scope of where we are today really started. So we hired at that time she was a provost, but she really did handle diversity initiatives, the late Dr. Wanda Mitchell. We added LGBTQ people status commission as well as people with disabilities. And we now have a staff of about 3 and a chief diversity officer in the role.
So literally decades, this work has been going on. Some, maybe at the long end of things, but you certainly, all of your institutions sounds like, very much have a head start. I would say again, compared with the private and public sectors. So I'm curious to know what does each of your offices actually do on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis? Do you have specific initiatives? I know some of you mentioned some of the role and staffs or the staff and roles. Just curious to learn more about how it actually looks and operates.
I guess I'll jump in here. So our office just recently went through a reorganization. So we sort of tried to streamline all the civil rights compliance pieces along with our programming. So on our compliance side, we have about 5 people in that team. And on the programming side, we have 3. So we keep the work pretty delineated, but also there's some overlap in terms of our diversity plan and our affirmative action plan. But yeah, for the programming side, we do a lot of institutional workshops and facilitations. We do some community work, especially at Dartmouth Hitchcock, and other regional private institutions, just engaging in dialogue about anti-racism, implicit bias, sort of the impact of all that.
So UNH is similar but different in that we have the Office of Community Equity and Diversity. So that's the office I'm in, and we're kind of the overarching office of, so if you're kind of were to chart out an org chart, we oversee efforts across all campuses, but that's only 3 of us. So we certainly could not do this work extensively with 15,000 people with 3 people. So we're really fortunate to also have a formerly known as the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. So they're dealing with more student facing. They're now the Beauregard Center for Justice, Liberty, and Freedom. And and then each unit has different offices. But our Chief Diversity Officer is kind of overseeing all those efforts and working to connect them. I, in my role, do more training programming. So we have a couple different programs around Black History Month where we bring in speakers and do a lot of awareness building, but then we also have our Gapril events. So since June falls outside of our academic year, we call it Gapril. So that's where our LGBTQIA focus. And then Indigenous Peoples Month in November, we try to do a lot of collaborative efforts. And then certainly a couple different efforts around disability as well.
So our office, similar to what Allison mentioned, we are the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at SNHU is more of the strategic planning and execution for equity and social mobility. So we support other offices such as that actually were in place before our office, such as diversity programs, the Office of Diversity Programs, the Women's Center, Global Citizen Circle, and the Center for Community Engagement. So we support offices like that, and we also have an employee-led council, the Diversity Council, that does programming. But our role for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion is a lot of strategic planning. Some specific initiatives that we have are, learning and development programming, training, workshops. We are focusing more this upcoming year on curriculum and program review. research, partnerships, and collaboration with executive stakeholders and, you know, all departments across the university in order to advance our strategic plan. And right now, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion has 6 members, soon to be 7. My role is, as Will mentioned, I know, Allison, thank you. As Will mentioned, my role is a project coordinator, and we have the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. We have an AVP for Strategy and Outreach, Director of Equity and Inclusion for Student Success. So they really work more towards all student-geared programs. Director of Equity and Inclusion for Academic Affairs. So their role is to work with faculty, staff, and academics to develop, you know, our curriculum, programs, all of that. And our administrative manager who holds us all together. And we are actually hiring for a Director of Equity Design in Higher Education.
Sounds like a lot, but all of you are doing, which is great. I'm curious, I just wanted to pick up on something that Sofia kind of hinted at. She you know, mentioned some community efforts. She mentioned, you know, Dartmouth Hitchcock and others. I'm curious to know, you know, what in what ways, if at all, you know, do you interact, you know, on, you know, DEI, in the DEI sphere, you know, with the larger community that you're in, kind of off campus? You know, do you do anything in that realm?
Yeah, I mean, one of UNH's pillars is Embrace New Hampshire. So we definitely spend probably 20 to 30% of our time, if we look at our overall training calendar for the year. So we have been asked to come into a lot of educational places, so K through 12 education. I've done a presentation on gender for some private businesses and diversity workforce coalitions. So definitely doing a lot of awareness building outside of UNH as well. I mean, there is a small fee attached to it, but it's, you know, very minimal compared to what a lot of private consultants. So that's kind of how we offer our Embrace New Hampshire model. And then just one other piece is that UNH does a really good job of collaborating with like the Black Heritage Trail. I know Shnu is helping put on like the Black New England Conference as well. So there's just a lot of, because of our academic research base, and I'm sure Dartmouth is the same way, Sophia, right? So there's just this notion also is that we have just local experts on campus to be able to lend themselves to conferences and voices around the content side of things and historical complexities around oppressive culture. So we do that as well.
Yes, we do have, for us, we have the Black New England Conference coming up at the end of September, in a couple of weeks actually. So that's very exciting. And the pandemic has really uprooted how we partner with external stakeholders. So last year, for example, in November, we had an Inclusive Innovation Day. Inclusive Recreation Day. And we partner with a lot of different companies, organizations, vendors throughout New Hampshire that provide recreational opportunities for people with disabilities. So that was open to the entire community. And normally, so I am in charge of community events and community engagement, but you know, it was much easier when we were able to host an event and advertise it to the community and say everyone's welcome, anyone in the local community, everyone that's part of our SNHU community, please come in. So we are rethinking how we work those events now virtually.
Similar to what Maria just said, we are totally grappling with that as well. Our biggest thing that we're looking forward to next year is we're trying to plan a symposium on the Rodney King incident that happened about 30 years ago in the LA riots, and sort of how those issues are still salient in the community today. But with that initiative, we are partnering up with a couple of institutes and nonprofits that are local here. We also do, again, anti-bias and implicit bias trainings, privilege and identity trainings for other regional organizations like the Listen Center, and like Allison said, K-12 organizations as well. Just because I don't feel like they have from my experience, they don't have the officers or the dedicated personnel to do that. And so we sort of tag team on that and help out whenever we can.
Nice. So, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here. You have the community efforts, but it really sounds, I mean, you are colleges and universities, so I think it would make sense that the focus of your respective DEI efforts would be student focused. I'm curious to know too how your DEI efforts have been made on the campus workforce side of things. Obviously, each one of you is a good sized organization, has a lot of employees. How are you really doing focusing your DEI efforts on workforce to attract and retain people of color there?
I guess we launched our C3I, so Campus Climate and Culture Initiative Ambassador Program in October. And with that, we had like a 3-day facilitation where we trained faculty and staff who sort of applied to be ambassadors, and really gave them the toolkit to sort of start these initiatives, these conversations within their own respective divisions and departments. We also have employee resource networks, which are really instrumental in sort of allowing people the space, the opportunity to engage with their identity groups, and just have that to sort of advocate for themselves and talk about things that matter to them, issues that they're dealing with. And they also help out a lot with recruitment and retention.
I really appreciate this question because I am a firm believer that in order to serve our stakeholders, which in this case are our learners, or I should say are one of our most important stakeholders, we really need to support and set a base for who is serving our learners directly. So all of our employees and supporting them, giving them resources. So some of the things that we have done is similarly to what Sofia mentioned. We launched a culturally engaging campus environment survey, so a CC survey, that went out to all online students, campus students, faculty, and staff, and it broke them down into different demographics so that we could get the best data out of it, the most accurate data out of it. We do training and workshops, so as I mentioned, I do programming, so I will do regular workshops throughout the year, and everyone is welcome to come, but we also do team targeted workshops as people request them. So programming, data research and analysis, we recently did an 18% study to look at the 18% people of color that we currently have at SNHU and how we can support them better. We also have, we're working on micro-credentials. So we have been big on micro-credentials lately, and we're finding that they really work for people. So we're building out a micro-credential that people can take at their own pace, go through the material, take their time, and then at the end, they'll have an acknowledgement certification on what they have learned for that micro-credential. We also have been putting together a DEI library. So we have been working with our library services because a lot of people reach out to us, a lot of employees and staff reach out to us and say, hey, what can I read? What can I do? And we have thousands and thousands of employees, so it's difficult to really figure out what's best for people on an individual basis. So putting together a DEI library has been a big resource. And last but not least, the Social Justice Fund. So the board recently approved a $5 million social justice fund for us to spend at our discretion to support underrepresented learners and employees. So that's something that we are working on right now.
So our office does a little bit of student-facing stuff, but we actually are kind of more focused on overall climate and culture at UNH. So there's probably 5 areas that I can quickly touch on. So we just finished a campus climate survey last year, which both measured, it was with Rankin Associates, so a national consultant that does this work across the entire country. And so it was for staff, faculty, and students. So it was all, but it was the data was broken down. So there's a lot for us to still sift through around practices and culture around how does that impact one's feeling of inclusivity at UNH. But the Commission on Community, Equity, and Diversity, which were those 4 commissions I talked about in the beginning that were kind of spearheaded UNH's efforts around diversity, are now into one. So that group at some point, like we added breastfeeding rooms, we have gender inclusive restrooms, like, so they oversee a lot of the campus culture issues that are both beneficial for staff and faculty. We have a PAT council and OS council, so those are staff councils as well as faculty senate that raise a lot of issues around inclusive practices at UNH that our office kind of looks at. And so, for example, we just updated, well, we worked with the entire university system of New Hampshire to update the online systems to allow for a chosen name option, as well as gender identity, expanded pronoun and gender identity options, whereas before it was really based more in sex, which isn't the most inclusive practice for paperwork. So there's things like that that are coming up where you can make sure that you're not being misrepresented. But we also have a long-term program called UNH Advance, which is really looking to improve faculty climate, and includes kind of some look at policies and practices. And then we have a postdoctoral diversity and innovation scholars program, and then a McNair Scholar program, which isn't directly related to that, but obviously if they stayed at UNH and pursued their doctorate efforts that way, that would be really great. But I will add one other caveat, which is like, I dreamed that we have a $5 million diversity initiatives fund, but we are a public institution and resources seem to be always our biggest roadblock to being able to implement all the beautiful ideas that people bring forth, that we wish we could just click our fingers and have a million more spaces and places where people feel connected. But alas, we are here.
Yeah, no, a lot of great ideas out there, resources, for all of us, always a limitation. Maria, I wanted to follow up on one of the things you said. You mentioned micro credentials. Is that something like in the DEI sphere that that is available to the public, or is that just for employees?
So our micro-credential will initially be available to employees. However, we do also have a micro-credential department at SNHU that has been putting things out. Like, we put out a lot of COVID-related resources for the entire public. So I think that that's something that we're working towards, but first it will be aimed towards employees.
I would, Allison, Sofia, and Maria too. I know, Allison, you mentioned, some of the trainings and things that UNH, offers for a fee and all of that. I'd say if you can send us any of those things that are available, to the public that we can share with this group, afterwards, or if you want to throw something down in the chat, feel free to do that too. We definitely want to, share resources that can help, companies out as best we can.
Well, and I did forget 2 really important pieces, which make me laugh because they're what my job is, which is I'm always so external. So we have our social justice educator program, which is mostly for staff and faculty. It's not a student program, but it talks about the framework of social justice and evaluates a lot of bias issues and implicit bias, so that when you're in the workplace and the work, hopefully you can become more aware, so you're not then practicing microaggressions on your colleagues and things like that. So, and then we also have a bias response software system that's in the throes of being changed. It was called Report It, but we have an entire system for staff and faculty as well as students around bias incidences and how to report that.
Yeah, that's all of you. It sounds like so much is being done, on so many levels. It's big, it's broad. I'm curious, with all of this and, dealing with these, topics, which are weighty, heavy, important things, what have the results been, of all of your respective DEI efforts, and as you work to make your campuses, more welcoming places for people to study and to work. What have you seen? Some of you have been at it longer than others, but what have the results been, and how do you measure success of these types of things?
I can hop in. I mean, actually, we just have a new chief diversity officer coming into place, so it's a bit premature. I know she's going to put in some really valuable measurement processes, and at the risk of completely skirting your question, Will, the challenge, of course, being is we still, from a staff and faculty standpoint and student, is we're still in New Hampshire, right? So there's a lot we can do with campus culture on campus and trying to, even availability of different foods and things like that. Like those are things that just that help you feel more welcome in the spaces that you're in. And so, but those are hard to measure, right? So if you're kind of going into the cafeteria and, our food tends to be catered to a white, predominantly white audience. So it doesn't have, some of the spices or some of the, things of that sort. So, but at the same time, like we have 15,000 students, so we're trying to be mindful of that. And then also it's just like, how do you feel when you step off campus? Do you feel safe? Do you feel targeted? And so those are other pieces that unfortunately lend themselves to why people may go but may not hit those metrics, is like, oh, I can't find a hairdresser, which is fine if you grew up in Nashua, right? Like there's just like, if you're from New Hampshire, you're used to that. But if you're coming from Miami, you're not used to not being able to like find a space to go find community really easily. And so in New Hampshire alone, that's pretty impactful for all of our BIPOC staff and students, for sure.
Sofia, you want to hop in and talk about how Dartmouth is measuring success on these issues?
Yeah, so I didn't need to cut Maria off. I feel like we sort of unmuted ourselves at the same time. So we heavily try to rely on sort of evaluations and assessments, right? So through our C3I, every initiative we do, every training we do, we solicit feedback and we sort of implement that the best way we can. Similar to Allison said, it's sort of tough to gauge how to prioritize different things because we do have a very diverse community. I feel like we have the most recent stat is we have the highest percentage of 1%ers in terms of our students, and we also have the highest percentage of Indigenous students, right? So just the dichotomy, the diversity of experiences of our student body, let alone our faculty and staff, right? So it's sort of tough to prioritize what to do first. Like I feel like everything's constantly on fire, but again, sort of making sure that we do tap into the needs of all of our students and our employees in terms of their needs and sort of issues they're dealing with. And then we also have started to like build out curriculum, right? So for different divisions on campus, students have actually come to us to say, hey, we need to have more like inclusivity and equity training for even just the students and also obviously the faculty, but if we can start the conversation with the students at some point. And so right now we're working with our business school, our School of Engineering, and our School of Arts and Sciences to sort of build out a multi-year curriculum for our students and have like the train the trainer model as well. That way our upper level students can also facilitate these conversations with the first years and second years and sort of have that sort of grow as the years go on.
I appreciate that sentiment, Sophia. Everything feels like it's always on fire. So aside from the CC survey, we send out monthly Pecan surveys. So that's for faculty and staff, and they're able to rate a number of things and how they're engaged, and diversity inclusion is one of those areas that they rate. Another way we measure success in our initiatives is the number, like the data on representation. So the representation numbers, retention and success metrics for both students and staff. And that also helps inform our initiatives and our strategic plan. So some of the efforts that help in creating a welcoming space is, for example, we have inclusive innovation grants. So every year, twice a year, we open up inclusive innovation grants for people to apply with their their ideas. We have had the coolest applications from one of them, unfortunately, the pandemic stopped, was Black Hair Matters. So going back to what Allison was saying, this initiative was going to bring together a lot of local hairdressers, hairstylists, and a lot of different products that you don't normally find at, you know, your Target or something like that. And we fund those initiatives. So we empower people to carry out something that they truly care for, that they feel is needed in the community. And I support them on the administrative side, and we fund the initiatives. I also think program audits have been a part of how we're helping people feel more welcome and comfortable here. As, for example, for our global education movement, someone was taking a course that said, think of a coffee maker. And they were like, what's a coffee maker? So it's things like that we, you know, for our online students and our, you know, global education movement, how are we presenting ourselves to them? Are we making our content inclusive? Are we making our content equitable? Are we making it accessible? So those are some of the things that we constantly measure. And as Sofia was saying, we get feedback regularly on trainings, on courses, and we use that to guide how we adjust.
Excellent. Yeah, like I said, I can definitely see the challenge of being able to measure the success of these measures and initiatives. But it definitely sounds like you all are kind of on the right track there. I'll also say kind of on a related note, you mentioned the Black Hair Matters, which is sounds like a great initiative. I mentioned the Rising Stars Awards earlier, and our Young Entrepreneur of the Year actually is a young woman named Shaquanda Allen, who owns a Roots hair salon on the west side of Manchester. That's really focused on providing that type of service and expanding that community here in the state. Focused on the hair needs that are very real. And Sofia can correct me if I'm wrong. I remember talking to someone at Dartmouth maybe a year ago. It might have even been Michelle Hale, who I believe is on the call here today, saying that Dartmouth, actually pays for somebody to come up to Boston, once a month, at least pre-pandemic, to do folks' hair. So really, working to take care of all of these needs that a lot of us, certainly me as a straight white male, I'm not. Honestly, I never would have thought of that, but these are very, very real needs. So it's great to see that, all of you on the campuses, as you work to attract and retain a diverse student population. And that said, I think it's fair to say that, college campuses are different than maybe more traditional workplaces that a lot of the folks who are on this call today, work at and work for. So I'm curious to know, you've everyone here has been a part of an organization that stood up and operated the EI offices for several years, some a decade or more. Given all of that, and of course the differences between academia and maybe the private sector. Given all of that, what advice would you give for folks here who are on the call today, in other sectors who are looking to incorporate a DEI focus in their organizations, or to, maybe expand it or take it to the next level? You've learned a lot, you've done a lot over the years. What advice do you have for folks who are looking to do similar work, who also want to attract and retain, BIPOC, and thank you for explaining that in the chat, Allison, those populations of employees?
I actually really like this question. I'm so glad you posed it, and I just don't even know where to begin, right? Because I feel like all of us can sort of just throw out a lot of things. The first thing that comes to mind, though, is it doesn't have to be like a major change that you all are doing, or a major audit or anything like that. I think even like the smaller initiatives or the more nuanced programs that can be implemented, I think go a really long way. So like Allison said, we are also working on sort of looking at our food options in our cafeteria to make sure we have halal food, or kosher food or actually tasty like vegetarian food, right? Because we oftentimes sort of have like bland options for our students, and obviously that doesn't make for a good setting for them, right? We also try to have more inclusive spaces. So we have a pretty sizable Muslim student population on campus. So noting that there isn't like a local congregation space they can go to, we have a dedicated space on campus for the MSA to utilize for their prayer space. And we also have an alternative chapel for other non-denominational students or employees to use. So really just looking at smaller issues that can be easily sort of remedied, but also looking at our policies, not only our like actual policies, our policies by practice, right? So we often say a lot of things in our policies just to be compliant, but there are things that we do on a day-to-day basis in terms of how we engage with our employees and our students and really our community in general, right? So just making sure that we are being the most inclusive and equitable. I feel like people talk about diversity a lot, but knowing that's really just the floor, right? You sort of want to grow from that to inclusion and equity and belonging. And then really constantly being on that cycle of once you feel like you're here at belongingness, sort of going back and making sure that you're sort of capturing all as many as demographics that you all have in your spaces as possible.
I will go next just because I think Maria's probably going to be in a space to give you guys a happier ending than what I might share. It's because I believe this work to be a place of our own liberation. And so for me, I always encourage people to start and looking at and asking the question, if a Black person never walked through your doors again, would you still care about race? You know, and ultimately, if the answer is yes, like that's the place where you can start on your own kind of liberation to eliminate racism in America and in your workplaces. And so I think there's a lot of self-reflection that has to happen. And this comes from someone who's like not educated in social justice theory, who grew up in white, homogenous, rural New Hampshire, who never talked about race for 1 second of my life, who never thought about my majority represented identities and what that means and how much I didn't know. And so how could I possibly be an advocate or an ally at the table when I honestly had no idea about the depths around my role as a white person in society, whether I was personally responsible for that or not. But just being able to continue upholding some of those systems of privilege and power completely unbeknownst to me. So I actually think that looking and evaluating your workplace, there are some really great work forums out there. The word might turn you off, so just realize I'm going to change it. You might find it under a different title, but it's called like white dominant culture. It may also show up as white supremacy culture. And I know that that's a triggering word if you haven't been kind of steeped in what that means, but there's like all these characteristics that I was like, wow, you know, perfectionism. And then, but there's like also what else you can look at doing, right? And so it's whether you have like the field of dreams notion of if you build it, they will come. If you build inclusive cultures, will you start getting a more, will you build a more equitable and just workforce that will therefore kind of get a variety of voices at the table? And then when they're there, how do you uphold those voices? How do you raise those voices up and recognize that like equity isn't equality? And so you would have to, if there is, so identify as a lesbian. So if there's one lesbian at the table and I'm the only one and I'm saying this is a really big issue and everyone else is straight, like how do you give as much weight to my work, my words, so that you can create practices that kind of get there? So awareness building, education, understanding, and then so I kind of have, I'll end with my 3 A's. I'm a big fan of A's. I don't have anything to do with my name of Allison. Ignore all of that. But I consider it awareness, accountability, action. Because in this country, if you don't have accountability, then the point of action tends to maybe not see its way through. But if you have those systems of accountability in place, those actions you want to take often find more success and more traction. So.
I appreciate your remarks, Allison and Sofia. I would say when people ask us what has been one of the most difficult parts of standing up your office and getting people involved, it's always buy-in. So from a survey we took a few years ago, a more unofficial survey that we took a few years ago, one of the trends that we found is that people say, yeah, right, racism exists, but like over there. Like, that's not my problem, or that's not, you know, I'm not racist, so I don't really have to fix anything. Rather than acknowledging that it's all, like, it's everyone's responsibility, it's everyone's duty to create a welcoming and equitable environment. So I think that one of the biggest things is just make sure you have, as Allison mentioned, accountability and measures, but also incentive measures for the work, so that people see it as important to the organization and to their role. So presenting DEI work always as a business case, even though it is also the right thing to do. We also try to always tie our initiatives back to why it's good for business, why it's good for SNU, why it's good for, you know, higher education, for our learners, for employees, and why it's important for every single person to embed it in their role. I would say another thing is to support employee resource groups. So as I mentioned, we work with a diversity council. I actually chaired the diversity council before I started working for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And that was just a really empowering group to be part of, because we were able to directly connect with people that we would see every day, and people that, you know, had questions started reaching out to us. Hey, I have this is going on in my team, what do you recommend? And we were able to point them, because we were an unofficial employee, you know, an employee group, but volunteer based, we were able to point them to the correct resources. So kind of having those diversity, equity and inclusion change agents on the ground, but truly supporting those efforts, not just saying, hey, yeah, you can build it, but really making sure that every manager is supporting the time taken for those efforts, and, you know, supporting that an employee may miss this meeting to go to that meeting. And with that, just spending time building trust and relationships. You know, this work is a marathon and not a sprint. So we just have to continue to build those relationships and build trust, and make sure that people, again, with buy-in, people believe that we're doing this because we want to help them succeed, not just because it's our job as an office and we just want to be successful. We're trying to help everyone succeed. So we, you know, again, we try to be data-driven, and as much as, you know, we make a business case, we also don't want to forget that the qualitative data is just as important as a quantitative. And I would say lastly, just keep an open mind. There's so much that changes every single day. And there's so much that we still don't know. As DEI professionals, we're learning every single day. So don't feel discouraged, and just keep an open mind and a growth mindset.
Always great advice for all things, and especially this one. I will remind everyone on the call that if you have any questions, we do have a few minutes that we can address some of those. I know we have one in there we'll get to in just a second. So if anyone else has any questions for any of our panelists, if anything you've heard today has sparked some curiosity, or you just want to give a comment, feel free to throw them down there in the comments, and we can get to them. Before we go to our first audience question, I am curious to know if any of you, I mean, you've heard, I don't know if any of you have known each other before this call or have ever met. Curious to know if any of you have heard anything today that you want to comment on, or has sparked a thought of your own. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I just wanted to echo some sentiments that Maria just shared about like having that buy-in and support, right? I feel like oftentimes we all, even us as DEI professionals, sort of get bogged down in the weight of everything. And having those actionable allies who might identify as cisgender or other dominant identities, having them as allies supporting our work and not sort of tokenizing other marginalized identity folks on campus or in your organization, I think really, really goes a long way, right? So for people not always see like my face or or hear my voice, right? But also hear other colleagues of mine or other executive leaders who might be white, who might be cisgender, but also supporting and being present and advocating for other programs or other initiatives, or even talking about these issues, right? As Allison mentioned, they can be very uncomfortable, but having that vulnerability and sort of showing that from the executive leadership level really goes a long way to sort of dictate what's expected in our campus and our community.
Thank you so much, Will, for sharing that Dartmouth brings someone from Boston to do hair once a month, you know, pre-pandemic. I love that. And I think that one thing that I try to remind myself is that as much as we're a, strategy, outreach, planning office that supports other on the ground efforts, we also, as much as we have the bandwidth to, we, things like that, that's an amazing initiative that I think really all workplaces or universities or whatnot can support, that can make a really big difference, that can provide a really big impact. So that's something that really resonated with me, and thank you for sharing.
Oh, it's funny. I am a SHNU grad. I graduated in 2004 before there was such a thing as offices and units and huge campuses. So I'm just really honored as an alum to hear all the work that's kind of expanding and growing out. I do know Jada well, and so I am somewhat connected, but it is such a large effort that they have ongoing there. And I do love the efforts that you were talking about, Maria, around one thing we definitely have to work on is curriculum design and building out in conjunction with kind of awareness, because we still are a lot of white people teaching, frankly. So we have kind of twofold, but, and then Sofia's talk about Indigenous communities. I mean, UNH has just started this, and I would love to just connect with you offline, Sofia, about how do you reconcile kind of the history of Dartmouth with creating and recognizing Indigenous communities, as UNH is a land-grant university. There's a lot wrought in that for Indigenous cultures, in the United States and in the Northeast. So I'd just love to connect more to hear about how you balance the politics with the reality.
Well, cool. Well, thank you all. We do have one question coming in from Jim Schachter, the president of New Hampshire Public Radio. He says, at the risk of asking a self-interested question, I'm curious to know what the panelists think media in New Hampshire can be doing to better further the advancement of DEI principles.
I saw that earlier and I was excited about this question. So I will start. I will just name one thing because I'm sure we could go on forever, but I would say language. I think language is so important. It sets the foundation for how we talk about other people that are not like us, right? So like we other people a lot. So talking about, people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, how you talk about pronouns, how you talk about sex and gender, how you talk about all of our different identities. I think that's huge, just how words have so much power behind them. So I think that just becoming aware of what your organization is doing to educate yourselves on how you're using words and, how you're presenting yourself to the public, I think that's a huge first step.
Yeah, I would add, I actually just had a situation with a media professional, not at NHPR, around the language piece. So I would absolutely echo language, but I also I think I would share that, I know you all are probably tired of me saying the self-exploration piece, and it's exhausting, but it is understanding the historical context of our own identities and how that might carry us forward. And, systems that we might find that are super helpful to use for resources may have so for example, I'll just name something that came up on the exchange last week that I think it seems like a bit of a call out, but it's just something that struck me, Jim. So please know this is definitely a growth opportunity for all of us. But, for me, I know that Stay Work Play works really closely with chambers of commerce, but there may be a historical piece to how chambers of commerce may not always have inclusive environments for the Black, Indigenous, people of color businesses, or they may just not have as large of a presence within those communities. So they may not see that resource in the same way. And so how do we acknowledge that there is differences that exist? But I mean, as one of the major systems from our socialization in the United States of America, media is right up there with family and in school. So you all have a really huge role to play. And I think that I have seen, and I really appreciate that I can come off a little bit where people think oh, it's a bit performative, but at the end of the day, the more you can do to tell like real stories and the deeper stories, even if it may not be popular to your dominant population, it does set the change in place so that that 16-year-old that's listening to that exchange and is really talking about the deep stuff that we don't talk about in others, like other spaces, like you may be presenting them with something they've never thought about before, and who knows what that leads to. So.
I just want to highlight what Allison just said, because I feel like that's really, really important, right? So oftentimes when we talk about implicit biases, we sort of unpack it as to the root of where those start, right? And oftentimes those conversations, we highlight the images that are shared in the media, or the conversation, the stories that are shared in the news. And I feel like it sort of sets the tone for what our implicit biases are. So whenever you think about something like a story that's shared about the Middle East, right? It's often sort of talked about in this dystopian war-torn region, or even the African continent. We talk about it in terms of impoverished nations and discord, but we never sort of unpack the root of why those happen, right? So I think it's really important to, as much as possible, unpack those, but also change the narrative and talk about different aspects of those regions, right? There are so many African countries, right? Africa as a continent is not homogenous, but people talk about it as a homogenous region. And also highlighting that, like even South Central America, right? They're not homogenous regions. So highlighting major economies or positive stories about those regions really go a long way to sort of combat those implicit biases that we as a general population have. It's interesting whenever we talk about these regions or these identities or these experiences, we often, again, sort of other those identities. So sort of drawing on those commonalities and making sure that we do have those conversations, I think are really very important.
Well said. Thank you all. Actually, have another question from actually Trisha McLaughlin at also at NHPR. She asks, how do you win over the cynics around this work, or those who don't see the value or connect with this issue? So I heard making the business case is one way, but would welcome other anecdotes.
We sort of start with that uncomfortable, as Allison again mentioned, it's really uncomfortable to do that self-assessment, but we really just dive into that in the outset. So having sort of like a privilege exercise, but sort of framing it as not an indictment on people's experience, right? Privilege, I feel like right now has become this triggering word. So sort of unpacking that to say it's not an indictment on your experiences. It's really just sort of highlighting that if you don't think this stuff applies to you, maybe it doesn't apply to you personally, it applies to someone or affects someone with whom you engage with, right? So typically in our workshops, we put out an anonymous poll after we do the privilege exercise. We share people's numbers in an anonymous way. So it's a range from like 0 to 15. And so just highlighting that at the outset, so people sort of have that buy-in of, okay, well, it affects someone I know or someone I'm engaging with, and hopefully that sort of allows them to have that personal buy-in. But again, it is really difficult to sort of have those conversations and highlight those experiences. So I say that with the caveat of you will always receive pushback on that. So trying to sort of frame it as just talking about systemic issues and other sort of more salient concerns of people who come from marginalized identities, and talking about how people can be actual allies in doing even like smaller things, or if it's not like a large scale thing, but making it more personable, I think has really gone a long way in sort of helping us sort of build out the allyship on campus.
Going off of what Sophia mentioned about, some things can be really triggering for people. So when you talk about privilege, male privilege, white privilege, people are like, well, I've worked really hard in my life. That's not what it means. So I think that in our office, one thing that we use is restorative practice. Not always easy to use. Restorative practice looks to discuss the deed and not the doer. So we look to discuss, okay, so let's think about that thought that you have, or this notion that you have of why it's not important to you, or why you should not be charged with this effort, or why you think racism doesn't exist and things like that. So let's talk about those rather than saying, well, you're privileged and you wouldn't know. So we just try to use restorative practice because it is such, topics can be so difficult for people. And when you make it a conversation where it's like, well, you're wrong, it's just going to shut down the lines of communication. So the approach we always try to take in our office is restorative practice, restorative justice, and just talking about, you know, okay, so this is what you think, or this is what you have done, and now let's look at how it has affected people or this one person, or what the outcomes of that is, but specifically looking at action and outcome rather than blaming the person. Like, the person is not bad, the deed may be bad, but the person is not, or we're not treating them that way.
Yeah, I would just build on everything that's been said. I will say that it really is so deep. And so the reality is that we've been so conditioned, I'll do a quick side. Do you all know how to use reactions? If you've heard of the movie or seen the movie The Matrix, do you want to give me a thumbs up with the reactions in the corner? Okay, couple. All right. So like, if we think of our society like the Matrix, which is like, we just have all these messages literally fed to us since birth about how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to look, how we're supposed to exist in this society. And then we stop and we evaluate what those messages are. There's like a lot of things that come up for people, but some of us are like, whoa, super fascinated. And they're like, that is amazing. I can't believe that I had that message given to me, right? It's a socialization. Like, it's not an individual thing. And that's always the hardest thing about this work, is how to separate that you are not bad or good as a person on how your thought processes are. It's how you've been socialized based on your culture, your identity, wherever you may be, and how those messages were kind of fed to you through those different systems. And then you then assume that, but then when someone names it, you're like, oh, that makes me a bad person. I don't want to be a bad person. But it really has nothing to do with you as an individual in a lot of times, not 100%. So the hardest work is separating that out, and then being able to say, like, no, like, this is how you think because of who you are. But let's think about how we want to recenter or reorg how we want to do work. And so that's where those systems of accountability come into play, because ultimately, like, you are going to get pushback. But it's like, if you have buy-in, as Marie was saying about, and Sofia, about what your goals and intentions are, like, you can weather those kind of pushbacks you might be seeing, because ultimately you're like, we are committed to, like, eradicating racism, or we are committed to ensuring that, like, xenophobia is a thing of the past for America, or whatever it may be, right? Or all these things. But if you aren't centering the population or the issue you're trying to eradicate, like, you're just going to be able to fall off of it really easily, if that makes sense to anyone.
Well, thank you. Yeah, very much so. Let's see. I think that's, I believe that's all we have for our audience questions. So just taking another quick look. Yep, everybody says, thank you for what you're doing. I will echo that on behalf of everyone on the call today. So thank you to Sofia, Maria, Allison, for sharing your